Vikir exhaled slowly as the final motion fell into place. The fifth tooth. He had grasped it. Power rippled through his body. His mana pool was growing steadier, his aura flowing more freely, taking on the weight of liquid. It was the mark of a sword graduator, a height he had only reached at 30 in his past life. To touch it now at this age left him certain he was already beyond the man he once was. His swordsmanship sharpened with every movement. The path to the 10th form no longer felt distant. The technique hidden in the book, the lurking impact, held a depth of power he had only begun to taste. He shut the book, thoughts turning to Hugo. How much could he reveal without drawing suspicion? Too much or too little, and the balance would break. From his pocket, Vikir pulled out a small magnifying glass. Tilting it toward the window, he let the sun's beam fall across the open pages. Smoke curled upward as the parchment began to burn. He smirked. No one else, not even Hugo, would discover the secrets inside. The sound of boots approached. 2 guards appeared, alarmed at the faint smoke, and asked what had happened. Vikir's face was calm as he feigned regret, saying it was nothing more than a careless accident. He offered to report it immediately. The guards shook their heads, worried, but Vikir gave a faint smile and suggested they simply forget the matter. The book was worthless, hardly worth troubling Barrymore over. The guards exchanged a relieved glance and agreed. As he left, they whispered in surprise that Vikir was unusually kind to servants. Vikir walked away smirking, the secret erased in smoke and ash. Vikir made his way back to Hugo's office. The man was waiting, his sharp gaze fixed on him. Hugo asked if he had learned much from his time in the library. Vikir answered that he had, his calm tone drawing a smile of anticipation from Hugo, who pressed further, wanting to know what he had discovered. Vikir touched his chin as though weighing his words. He explained what he felt after studying the archives, that his body felt different. He explained to Hugo how it felt. Barrymore stiffened. From the way Vikir described it, it sounded as though he had touched upon aura. Hugo considered it. Even prodigies usually reached aura at the age of 15, yet Vikir was 8. The thought left him excited, though he wasn't sure why. Finally, Hugo asked Vikir to show him what he meant. Vikir smiled faintly and answered, "Of course." Hugo had gathered all the young hounds in the arena to witness what Vikir had learned. Barrymore stood beside him and asked what he intended to do to test young Master Vikir's skills. Hugo replied that he would pit Vikir against a monster. Vikir stood in the centre of the ring, waiting as the heavy gates rumbled open. A massive orc was led out, bound in chains and under guard. Gasps spread among the young hounds as they realized Vikir would face a dangerous Class C orc. Whispers rose. Why would an 8-year-old be sent against such a creature? Hugo raised his hand. The guards obeyed, releasing the chains. Then the orc let out a thunderous roar, then charged. Vikir did not flinch. As it closed in, his blade swept in a blur, severing the orc's arm. Another strike followed, and its foot was gone. The beast collapsed, stunned that a child had felled it so easily. Vikir watched it writhe. He knew orcs possessed high-speed regeneration, but with the skill he had gained from the hellhound, he knew the bleeding would not stop. Shock rippled through the stands. Hugo, however, showed no reaction. Vikir read his face and knew this was not enough to impress him. He drew a breath and activated his aura. His blade began to glow red, the sight finally drawing a response from Hugo and Barrymore. The orc tried to rise, but Vikir lunged forward, aura burning along his sword, and ended it with a single strike. Hugo nearly rose from his seat as Barrymore spoke in awe, declaring that the boy's aura was that of a low-class sword expert. He congratulated Hugo, saying they had witnessed the appearance of a rare genius, but Hugo did not get carried away. He asked Barrymore why the orc continued bleeding even though it should regenerate, then sat back and remarked that Vikir had only won because the orc was too weak. Vikir looked up at the stands, a faint smile on his face. He called out to Hugo and asked if he had anything stronger for him to fight. The crowd murmured in disbelief at Vikir's request. No one expected an 8-year-old to ask for something stronger after slaying an orc. He knew he needed to do more to impress Hugo. If he showed enough, he might be rewarded with the chance to train away from his watchful eyes. Hugo grinned at the boy's boldness. He turned to Barrymore, asking if they still had the monster they recently caught. At his order, it was brought out. Gasps rippled through the arena as a massive troll was dragged forward in chains. Vikir looked at it with anticipation and asked Hugo if he may begin right away. Hugo raised his hand for the chains to be removed, then announced that he could start. The troll roared as the iron restraints fell away. It swung a massive fist down, the ground trembling under the blow. Vikir darted aside, avoiding the strike, and briefly moved in behind it. Then he pulled back, retreating to a safe distance. The crowd whispered in confusion. Why retreat after gaining the advantage? Hugo, however, smiled. He called it a smart move. Trolls had remarkable regenerative powers. One needed the right moment to take it down with a single blow. Vikir kept moving, dodging strike after strike, watching carefully for an opening. The troll's breathing grew heavy. The onlookers began to wonder if Vikir's plan was to wear it out. To Vikir it was tedious. He could end this quickly, but he needed to make it look like a struggle. He couldn't reveal too much. It had to be believable. At last, he saw his chance. He darted in and slashed at the troll's shoulder. The beast let out a howl of pain and crashed to its knees. The blow wasn't fatal, but the crowd erupted in awe. To them, it was astonishing. An 8-year-old had wounded a troll, something even seasoned hounds would struggle to do. Vikir knew it wasn't enough. He had to finish it, but he also had to be careful. It needed to look like a hard-won fight. Hugo raised his voice, saying Vikir had shown enough, but Vikir called back that he was almost there. Give him one more strike. If he failed, he would yield. Hugo narrowed his eyes, then after a moment allowed it. Vikir steadied himself, gathering aura into his blade. He weighed how much power to reveal, deciding to make it look as though the sudden danger had forced him to break through. The troll roared and charged, shaking the arena with each thunderous step. Vikir lowered his stance, aura spilling from his blade. This was the moment. Hugo would see exactly what he wanted him to see. He surged forward, aura blazing. The two met head-on, and with one clean sweep, his sword cut through the troll's neck. Its head rolled across the dirt as the massive body collapsed. The arena fell into silence. The crowd stared with open mouths, unable to believe what they had seen. An 8-year-old had just attained the second form, exactly as Vikir intended them to believe. He feigned surprise, lowering his sword as though stunned by his own power. Hugo's eyes widened, and for the first time, even he looked shocked. 1 week later, Vikir sat in the dining hall. He ate in silence, noticing how the atmosphere around him had shifted. Since the fight with the troll, everyone had grown distant. The others looked at him differently, cautious and withdrawn. Still, seeing Hugo shocked had been worth it. They now recognized him as a mid-level sword expert who had reached the second form, but that was only what they believed. His true strength was far beyond, already touching the level of a low-class sword graduator with the incomplete fifth form, and after taking the troll's unique ability of high-speed regeneration, he was likely stronger than any ordinary graduator. He frowned. His appetite had grown even sharper since acquiring Beelzebub. Footsteps sounded behind him. Vikir turned, glaring as the triplets approached. His eyes narrowed. Were they here for another beating? But the three raised their hands quickly, insisting they weren't looking for a fight. They told him they had only come to say how impressed they were with his deeds. First the Cerberus, now the troll. Vikir blinked, then spat out his soup in surprise. What game were they playing? Anger began to stir, but before he could speak further, Barrymore appeared. He informed Vikir that his lordship was calling for him at once. At the main castle, an important guest had arrived. Hugo greeted Alfonso Morgue, though his expression showed little enthusiasm. Alfonso had come for the annual event that set House Morgue against House Baskerville in friendly competition. Alfonso remarked that he hoped there would be no serious injuries this year, unlike the last. Hugo dismissed him, saying the so-called injury was barely a graze, and that Morgue children were simply fragile. Alfonso replied, annoyed, that Morgue children were not fragile, but elegant and graceful. The two men glared at one another, Master of Mages against the iron-blooded Master of Swords. The two houses had not always been at odds. Magic and swordplay were once considered perfect partners by the Emperor, and that was why the event was created. Children between the ages of 8 and 15 were chosen to compete, but peace fractured when blood was spilled in the ruby mine, each house claiming it by right. Since then, the rivalry had deepened, though the training continued by imperial decree. That was why Alfonso had come in place of his sister, the family head. He looked to Hugo, remarking that he had heard a prodigy had emerged in House Baskerville. Hugo feigned indifference, saying it was nothing of note. Alfonso, knowing him well, recognized the satisfaction hidden beneath his calm. Then he smiled and said Morgue had a prodigy of their own. He called for her to enter. A young girl with red hair stepped into the room and sat beside Alfonso. He introduced her as Camille, his sister's daughter. He told her to greet Hugo. Camille paused, then asked if he was the bad man who had stolen their ruby mine. She told him to give it back, speaking with blunt rudeness. Hugo's eyes narrowed. He repeated her words. Bad man. Alfonso hurried to hush her, stammering that she was being impolite, but Camille said he was the one who had called Hugo a bad man first. Alfonso grew flustered and tried to deny it. He asked Hugo to forgive her, saying she must have misunderstood. Hugo smiled coldly. He told Alfonso not to worry, that it was only natural. After all, Morgue children received inferior education. But Camille blurted again, demanding her rubies back for her research. Hugo's smile vanished. He slammed the armrest and shouted enough, his voice heavy with menace. He said it seemed Morgue children were not taught manners. The room fell silent. Then the doors opened, and Vikir stepped inside. His voice was calm, yet cutting. He asked whether the Morgue family taught their children to covet what did not belong to them. Barrymore announced his arrival. Alfonso's eyes flicked toward him, curious. He wondered if this was the prodigy everyone had been whispering about. Was this really the one who had defeated a troll? Alfonso narrowed his eyes, trying to measure him, yet before he could think further, he noticed Camille had vanished from her chair. She now stood directly before Vikir, meeting his eyes. "What did you say?" she demanded. Alfonso called to her, and Vikir's eyes sharpened at the name Camille. He knew that name. The iron-blood Empress of Morgue. In his past life, she had risen as the strongest mage of her house. She slaughtered monsters and barbarians without mercy on Le Rouge et Le Noir, impaled bodies, and burned them alive. Her ruthlessness was feared, her beauty adored. But before him now was only an 8-year-old brat. Camille asked how the ruby mine could belong to Baskerville. Vikir told her she had come a long way, only to throw a tantrum. "A tantrum!" she snapped, her tone rising. She declared she would prove the mine belonged to Morgue. Summoning her magic, she sculpted the air into frost and ice, forming a model of both territories. Alfonso's eyes shone with pride at her display of skill. Camille pointed to a cave within her icy map, explaining that the entrance lay on Morgue land, though the mine stretched into Baskerville territory. Because the entrance was theirs, it should belong to them. Yet, she said, they had offered to pay for the right to mine it. Alfonso smiled, telling Hugo that even he could not have explained it better. Vikir asked if Morg required rubies for magical research. Camille agreed. Vikir replied that it was a pity, but Baskerville would not yield to such demands. Camille grew annoyed. If Baskerville had no use for the rubies, why not accept Morg's offer? Vikir's eyes were cold. The land belonged to Baskerville. Why should they allow trespass? The loss lay with Morg, not with them. Her temper flared. She stepped toward the borderline traced in ice. Pointing, she declared, "This side is mine, that side is yours." She stretched out her arm across the line. "Whose arm is this?" she asked, smirking. Vikir smiled faintly. "The arm that intrudes on our land," he replied. He caught her wrist firmly. "It's mine, of course." Camille froze, a faint blush on her cheeks. For once she faltered, unsure how to answer. Then she snapped back, insisting she did not belong to him. Vikir's eyes glinted as he drew a knife from behind his belt. He was not speaking of Camille herself, but of her arm. Camille's expression faltered, her voice edged with fear as she asked what he meant. Vikir moved his knife to Camille's wrist. At once, Camille called out to her uncle, fear in her voice. Alfonso rose to his feet, his aura flaring menacingly as he demanded that Vikir release his niece at once. Vikir let go. Camille ran to her uncle, clinging to him with tears in her eyes, crying that Vikir had been about to cut off her arm. Alfonso's glare shifted to Hugo as he demanded an explanation. Hugo looked toward Vikir and told him that he had gone a little too far with his joke. Vikir smiled faintly, holding the blade with a finger pressed to its tip. Then he bent it, revealing the knife had been a fake all along. He explained that this was the way Baskerville children would play. Alfonso was left stunned that it had only been a toy. He wondered what kind of children would call such dangerous things a game. Vikir bowed respectfully to Alfonso, apologizing for making Camille cry. Hugo chuckled and remarked that perhaps it was best not to interfere with the games of children. He then turned to Alfonso, suggesting that he might have a solution in mind regarding the ruby mines. It would be better, he said, to discuss it after the training. Camille, still teary-eyed, glared at Vikir and told him he would pay for this. And so the joint training commenced. The focus of the event for most of the watchers was on one battle above all others. Camille of House Morg against Vikir of House Baskerville, the two prodigies from each side. The bell rang to begin the duel. Camille warned Vikir that she would not go easy on him and immediately began to cast. Magic circles bloomed in rapid succession and the crowd gasped in awe. She was weaving 4 spells at once. Even those of 15 would struggle with such complexity, and she was only 8. A barrage of elements surged toward Vikir. He slipped through them easily, advancing on her position. He noted that while her display looked impressive, her accuracy was poor, and she would be better off focusing on a single spell. Camille scowled at the suggestion and raised a wall of earth to block his approach. Vikir smashed through it with ease, leaving her stunned. She closed her eyes as he closed the distance, berating herself for letting her guard drop. Bracing for the blow, she waited, but nothing came. Opening her eyes, she found Vikir standing before her, hand raised as though to flick her. Then, with a sharp snap, his finger met her forehead, and she went tumbling back. Up in the stands, Alfonso rose in disbelief. He could hardly believe what he had seen. Had the boy just flicked her? Camille pushed herself up, glaring, her pride stung. Had he really flicked her? Was he mocking her? Was he holding back? Vikir stood grinning, remarking that it looked painful. He told her it might be best to concede before she ended up hurt even more. Her face burned with anger. She summoned 2 walls of sand, raising them as a challenge and taunting him to try breaking through. Vikir thought to himself that he could simply walk around them, but where would the fun be in that? He drove his fist straight through both barriers, his arm bursting out the other side, his hand inches from her face. He asked whose hand it was that now crossed to her side, and answered his own question. It belonged to whoever was stronger. Then He flicked her forehead once more and smashed through the wall completely. Camille looked up at him, holding her forehead and grimacing. Her fury spilled over. Spells flew in all directions, but her rage had ruined her accuracy. Vikir barely needed to move to avoid them. To him, it was like swatting aside the tantrums of a child. He thought grimly that he could end her life here and now without effort, but killing her would bring nothing but problems. The challenge was finding a way to make her stop without hurting her too badly. His eyes drifted briefly toward another fight behind them, a clash that looked like a battle between two fools. Perhaps he could use that chaos to his advantage. Camille, screaming in frustration, demanded to know why she could not land a single hit. Her temper snapped, and she rushed him, calling him a brat. Vikir's sharp eyes caught movement over his shoulder. A Morg mage was standing further back, charging a massive flame spell. Vikir smiled at Camille, warning her to put up a defensive spell. He fell back a few steps from the platform, and the spell rushed past him. Camille, still on the stage, was caught in the blast as the flames struck. Then the arena shook with the explosion. A cloud of dust and smoke engulfed the arena. Alfonso called out for Camille, his voice tight with worry, but he could see nothing through the haze. Camille heard her uncle and froze, unsure what to do. She had saved herself at the last second with a defensive spell, but her clothes had been scorched. Her shirt was barely clinging on, and though the smoke hid her shame for now, once it cleared, she knew she would become a laughingstock. She prayed desperately for someone, anyone, to spare her from the humiliation. Through the smoke, a figure appeared. Camille looked up and saw Vikir standing before her. He pulled off his coat and handed it to her, telling her to cover herself before the smoke cleared. She hesitated, asking why he would help an enemy, but he only asked whether she wanted it or not. Grateful, she pulled it around herself, her thoughts clouded with confusion, as she wondered why he would look out for her at all. As she clutched the coat, she noticed something else. His arm was bleeding. Vikir glanced down and saw the cut, no doubt caused by a fragment of an infused blade scattered in the explosion. The smoke began to thin, and the arena slowly came into view. Gasps filled the air. Alfonso cried out in relief, seeing his niece alive and safe. But the sight left the crowd murmuring. Camille was on the ground, but Vikir was the one bleeding. They looked at one another in confusion, asking themselves who had truly won. Not long after the battle, Vikir walked through the halls with Hugo. Hugo asked how it felt to fight a mage. Vikir answered that it had been an interesting experience. Hugo agreed, noting that battling a mage was very different from facing another swordsman. Then he asked why Vikir had held back against her. Vikir admitted he had not been sure how to fight a girl. Hugo warned him that letting his guard down like that could get him hurt, and told him to consider it a lesson learned. Vikir was taken aback. Had Hugo just expressed concern for him? He could not remember much about Hugo from his early childhood in his previous life. All he had ever known was the strict and cruel man he later became. Rumours had said that Hugo changed after losing his first wife and daughter. Hugo soon shifted the subject, asking Vikir's thoughts on the ruby mine. Vikir suggested they give it to the Morgs. Hugo pressed him for his reasoning. Vikir explained that their true priority was conquering the wildlands and expanding their borders. The mine lay at the base of the mountains, a place crawling with monsters that harassed the Baskervilles. Better to use the Morgs to help keep that region clear. Hugo was impressed, praising him for an excellent answer. Then, with a sinister edge, Hugo added that they could even drive monsters toward the mine, turning the rubies even redder. 2 birds with 1 stone. He rubbed Vikir's head, saying the boy's plan was in line with his own. Of course, Vikir thought, that had been the very plan in his previous life. He had been the one driving the monsters down the mountains. As they turned a corner, they crossed paths with Alfonso and Camille. Alfonso asked Hugo if he might have a word before departing. Back in the reception room, Hugo asked what this was about. Alfonso explained that though they had already offered to pay for the rights to mine, there were other proposals for him to hear. When asked what he had in mind, Alfonso suggested a marriage between the families. His eldest son and the eldest daughter of Morgue, Camille. Hugo remarked that his eldest son was already 25, and the age disparity might be too great. Alfonso dismissed the concern, saying that a gap of 17 years was not so large. At this, Camille clenched the coat Vikir had given her. She stood suddenly, declaring that she would not marry anyone weaker than her mother. Alfonso laughed, calling her ridiculous, and told her that with such standards she would never marry at all. Camille retorted that she would consider potential, but she also refused to marry someone much older than herself. Hugo frowned and told her she could not simply pick and choose as she wished. Camille answered that she understood, but insisted she would not take just anyone as her husband. Then her eyes shifted toward Vikir, and her cheeks coloured faintly. Alfonso noticed at once. His face twisted in disbelief. He told her not to be ridiculous. She could not possibly mean Vikir. He leaned closer and whispered sharply that Vikir was not a legitimate son, that he did not even bear the middle name Le. She could not possibly marry a Van. Hugo heard the words and was not amused. He had long grown sick of such discrimination based solely on names. His expression hardened as he turned to Vikir, saying that the decision should be up to him. Camille's heart pounded as she waited for his answer. Vikir paused, the room holding its breath. When he finally spoke, the words came slowly, carrying a quiet finality. He said he will, then stopped. Alfonso leaned forward, panic rising in his eyes as he waited for an answer.